There is a strange paradox about luxury travel. You would think that paying thousands of dollars for an ocean view and unlimited food would make people deeply relaxed. But instead, it frequently creates an intense, hypersensitive environment where grown adults will fiercely debate the legal ownership of a buffet utensil. Let's look at exactly why vacation brains short-circuit. 1. It was 8:15 in the morning on day 3 of a Mediterranean itinerary when a 64-year-old retired regional logistics manager named Gary approached the guest services desk of a major European cruise company to formally demand that the captain physically rotate the ship, not change the itinerary, not sail to a different port, but pivot the 150,000-ton vessel exactly 90 degrees while it was completely turned off and tied to a concrete dock in Naples. Gary had paid $3,400 for a starboard-side premium balcony cabin, which, as he loudly explained to a remarkably unflappable Ukrainian crew member named Anton, guaranteed him a view of the ocean. Instead, because of how the harbor master had directed the mooring that morning, Gary's balcony was currently facing a concrete piling, 3 rusted shipping containers, and a local port worker who was sitting on a forklift eating a sandwich. Anton, operating with the exhausted patience of a man who had explained basic reality 12 times before breakfast, attempted to outline the concepts of harbor pilots, designated mooring bollards, and international maritime law. He gently noted that the ship was currently tethered to the pier by 14 separate steel wire ropes, each as thick as a human thigh, and that the engines were offline. Gary was entirely unmoved by this information. Have you ever watched someone's brain completely reject the laws of physics simply because they paid retail price for a vacation? It is a fascinating quirk of behavioral economics that when consumers purchase a premium upgrade, they frequently develop an absolute illusion of control, genuinely believing that structural engineering and gravity are subject to customer service adjustments. Gary pulled a folded copy of the ship's daily newsletter from his pocket, flipped it over, and used a purple highlighter to draw a diagram of the hull. He slid it across the counter, tapping the paper aggressively while suggesting that the captain could simply untie the back half of the ropes, use the starboard bow thrusters to kick the rear end out a little bit, and leave the ship wedged diagonally in the active commercial harbor so his wife Helen could take a decent photo of Mount Vesuvius from her lounge chair. The argument lasted for 25 minutes. It escalated from a minor complaint about a view into a highly aggressive, deeply incorrect debate about marine propulsion, during which Gary claimed he knew exactly how lateral thrust worked because he owned a 20-foot pontoon boat on a lake in Florida. He finally issued an ultimatum threatening to remove his daily automatic gratuities unless the captain put it in reverse and bumped it over. Anton stared at the purple highlighter diagram of the diagonal ship for a long, silent moment. He did not call the bridge. He did not argue about the pontoon boat. Instead, he slowly opened a drawer, retrieved a 15% discount voucher for the onboard specialty steakhouse, and pushed it across the counter. Gary looked at the voucher, nodded as if a major geopolitical treaty had just been ratified, folded up his diagram, and walked away entirely satisfied, leaving the 4,000-passenger vessel parked exactly where it was. 2. Up on the Lido deck of a crowded American megaship, a dispute broke out at the breakfast buffet that closely resembled a complex property law dispute, entirely centered on a pair of stainless steel tongs. A 48-year-old solo traveler named Brenda had been standing near the crispy bacon station when she laid eyes on the tongs resting next to the warming tray. Before she could actually reach out and pick them up, she realized she had forgotten to grab a plate and took exactly 3 steps backward to retrieve one from the ceramic stack. In that 3-second window, a 30-something guy named Kevin walked up, grabbed the tongs, and began transferring 3 slices of bacon to his plate. Brenda instantly lunged forward, raised her empty plate like a traffic stop sign, and loudly accused Kevin of intercepting her personal serving implement. She explicitly stated she did not want the specific bacon he was currently holding. She simply demanded the tongs, claiming she had established a visual lease on them by making eye contact with the metal handles before he arrived. Kevin, who was still holding the tongs with a piece of bacon suspended midway between the tray and his plate, stared at her in total bewilderment and whispered that he just wanted breakfast. Brenda refused to back down, treating the buffet utensil like a piece of inherited real estate that had been illegally squatted on. The physical standoff lasted long enough for a line of 9 hungry passengers to form behind them, halting the entire flow of the starboard dining room. The tension was only broken when a kitchen crew member hurriedly emerged from the swinging doors carrying a second, freshly washed pair of tongs and offered them to Brenda. She flatly rejected the new tongs, stating that the original pair were the ones she had spiritually claimed. Exhausted and wanting to end the scene, Kevin dropped his bacon back into the tray, handed the used tongs to Brenda, and took the new ones. Having finally won her disputed prize, Brenda took the contested tongs, completely ignored the bacon station she had argued over, used them to pick up exactly one slice of plain white toast from a different tray, and walked proudly back to her table, leaving Kevin staring at the breakfast buffet in absolute silence. 3. On the 8th deck of a massive 5,000-passenger Caribbean cruiser, a vicious territorial war erupted in the starboard hallway between two cabins that perfectly illustrates what happens when adults are stripped of their daily responsibilities and given too much free time. Cabin 8244 was occupied by a 32-year-old solo traveler named Marcus, who had decorated his metal door with exactly 3 minimalist geometric nautical magnets. Cabin 8246 was occupied by the Miller family, led by a 50-something father named Greg, who had covered their door in an explosion of customized cruise trip whiteboards, neon plastic palm trees, and heavy magnetic pineapples. The doors to the two cabins were separated by a flat steel wall panel that was exactly 14 inches wide. On day 2 of the 7-day voyage, Marcus noticed that one of Greg's large magnetic pineapples was overlapping the microscopic vertical crease in the wall panel that officially marked the boundary of Marcus's cabin space. It was crossing the line by roughly half an inch. Instead of knocking on the door or simply ignoring it, Marcus waited until the hallway was empty, gently slid the pineapple 2 inches back toward the Miller's side, and went to the casino. When he returned 4 hours later, not only was the pineapple back across the crease, but a neon palm tree had been placed aggressively close to his geometric magnets. Thus began a completely silent, relentlessly petty border dispute that lasted for 3 days. Every time Marcus walked past, he shifted the Miller's decorations back by millimeters. Every time Greg went to the ice machine, he pushed Marcus's geometric shapes closer to the doorframe. It is a known psychological phenomenon in isolated leisure environments. Without the routine stress of commuting, paying bills, or managing a household, the human brain will instinctively manufacture an artificial conflict just to give the day some structural stakes. By day 4, the situation had escalated to the point where Greg had actually used a roll of blue painter's tape to mark a physical line of demarcation down the center of the steel panel, and Marcus had called the deck supervisor to complain about unauthorized adhesive modification of company property. The deck supervisor, a deeply tired woman from Romania, stood in the hallway staring at the blue tape, the palm trees, and the 2 grown men standing with their arms crossed in front of their respective doors, before calmly informing them that neither of them owned the hallway and returning to her rounds. But the twist came on night 5. Marcus, absolutely determined to catch Greg repeatedly violating the blue tape line, set up his phone on a small tripod inside his cabin, pointed it out his slightly cracked door, and recorded a 3-hour time-lapse video of the hallway wall while both men were asleep. The next morning, Marcus proudly marched out to confront Greg, aggressively shoving the phone into the older man's face to prove his guilt. The video played. In the high-speed footage, the hallway was completely empty. Nobody came out of either door. But as the hours ticked by, the heavy magnetic pineapple and the neon palm tree very slowly, almost imperceptibly, slid across the steel panel and crossed the blue tape line entirely on their own. The ship was sailing at 22 knots through moderately choppy waters, and the constant, rhythmic vibration of the massive diesel engines echoing up through the steel superstructure was simply causing the heavier magnets to drift across the frictionless metal wall. The conflict was instantly solved by physics. There was no territorial disrespect, no silent sabotage, just the natural mechanical reality of a moving vessel. But rather than laughing at the absurdity of the situation and shaking hands, Greg stared at the time-lapse video, looked Marcus dead in the eye, and accused him of intentionally stomping on his cabin floor at night to create localized micro-vibrations specifically designed to steal his pineapple. The 2 men spent the remaining 2 days of the cruise refusing to make eye contact, utterly convinced that the other was a strategic mastermind in a war over 14 inches of painted steel. 4. by the main pool on a massive Caribbean vessel. An intense, hour-long dispute took place that was entirely dictated by the rotation of the Earth. A couple from Ohio had arrived at 8 in the morning and secured 2 premium loungers on the starboard side, specifically choosing a spot directly underneath the towering shadow of the ship's giant yellow smokestack to avoid the direct sun. What they entirely failed to account for was that the ship was a moving object. At 9:30, the vessel slowly altered its course by 15 degrees to navigate a reef, causing the shadow of the smokestack to slide 6 feet across the deck, completely abandoning the Ohio couple, and instead enveloping the loungers of 2 retired postal workers from Chicago. The husband from Ohio stood up, walked over to the retirees, and politely demanded they vacate their chairs. When the postal workers asked why, he stated with total sincerity that he had claimed that specific patch of shade an hour ago. And since the shade had moved, his ownership rights had moved with it. He actually argued that he had leased the absence of light, not the physical plastic chair beneath it. The retirees stared at him, utterly bewildered by the sudden introduction of solar property law, and refused to move. The Ohio man then dragged his own lounger across the deck, wedging it awkwardly close to the Chicago couple, determined to physically chase the shadow as it crawled across the teak flooring for the rest of the afternoon. 5. Deep inside the heavily perfumed, neon-lit cavern of Deck 6, an argument unfolded that perfectly isolates the human brain's deeply flawed relationship with probability. A 45-year-old woman named Diane had been feeding $1 bills into a bright purple slot machine themed around cartoon lobsters for roughly 40 minutes. After losing $23.50, she decided to walk 20 feet to the nearest bar to order a vodka tonic. She did not leave a sweater on the chair. She did not lean her player's card against the screen. She simply vanished. Approximately 60 seconds later, a 70-year-old woman from Toronto named Margaret sat down at the exact same lobster machine, inserted a single $5 bill, pressed the button once, and immediately triggered a jackpot of $212. The cabinet instantly began producing a series of loud, celebratory nautical sirens. Diane, hearing the distinctive digital screech of a wealthy lobster from the bar, abandoned her drink, sprinted across the patterned carpet, and confronted Margaret. What followed was not a physical fight, but an incredibly tense, whispered theological debate over the true ownership of statistical variance. Diane insisted that she had personally primed the machine through her prolonged financial sacrifice. She argued that she had methodically filled the software's theoretical reservoir of winnings, and Margaret had simply swooped in to harvest the crop. Margaret, gripping her printed cash voucher with the intensity of a diamond smuggler, coldly replied that luck is a location-based phenomenon, and Diane had abandoned her post. The psychology of gambling relies heavily on this exact fallacy, the belief that random number generators possess memory, fairness, and a sense of narrative justice. Diane demanded that Margaret hand over exactly $117.75, her original $23.50, plus exactly half of the remaining profit, which she classified as a legally binding finder's fee. Margaret countered by placing her hand flat against the side of the blinking cabinet, claiming she couldn't feel any residual energy of Diane's previous spins. The conflict eventually required the intervention of a floor supervisor named Vincent, who had the tired, hollow eyes of a man who dealt with this exact scenario twice a shift. He explained in a flat, monotone voice that the software processes 3 million random outcomes every single second, meaning Diane's theoretical winning combination had been mathematically obliterated several billion times over the moment she stepped away to order alcohol. Refusing to accept the crushing reality of microprocessors, Diane pointed a manicured finger at Margaret, told her she had incurred bad maritime karma, and sat down at an identical lobster machine directly to Margaret's left, spending the next hour violently slapping the spin button in complete silence just to ensure her neighbor couldn't enjoy the winnings. 6. Inside the main theater of a massive 4,000-passenger vessel, a truly bizarre argument broke out 20 minutes before a comedy show, entirely based on the psychological concept of phantom seating. A 52-year-old man named Ronald walked down the center aisle and spotted a perfect row of 3 empty seats near the front. He sat down in the aisle seat, placed his program on the middle seat, and laid a single pair of reading glasses on the far seat to save them for his wife and daughter, who were currently at the bar. About 2 minutes later, a couple in their 60s approached the row. The older man, completely ignoring the reading glasses, politely asked Ronald if the two inner seats were taken. Instead of simply saying yes, Ronald, operating on some deeply flawed instinct of territorial defense, panicked. He told the couple that the seats were currently occupied by two people who had simply gone to the restroom. The older man nodded, but then noticed the reading glasses. He looked at Ronald and asked in a perfectly deadpan tone why two separate people had gone to the restroom but left exactly one pair of reading glasses behind. Ronald, now entirely committed to his lie, claimed that his wife and daughter shared the glasses because they both had the exact same astigmatism. The older couple stared at him, utterly unconvinced, and simply stood in the aisle, refusing to move until these two identical visioned women returned. The standoff lasted for 10 agonizing minutes, with Ronald sitting in sweating, silent terror, guarding a pair of drugstore bifocals against two strangers who were absolutely determined to call his bluff over plush theater seating. 7. The sheer, unfiltered entitlement of cruise passengers is rarely confined to the ship itself. It frequently spills over into the local environment, transforming beautiful natural ecosystems into arenas for extreme petty grievance. During a high-speed catamaran excursion off the coast of Cabo San Lucas, a bitter 2-hour argument erupted over the intellectual property rights to a marine biology sighting. The boat was carrying about 40 passengers bouncing over the Pacific waves in search of local wildlife. Standing at the portside railing was a 50-year-old accountant named Paul, wielding a camera with a lens the size of a thermos. Next to him stood a 35-year-old marketing director named Amanda, wearing oversized sunglasses and holding a smartphone. Suddenly, about 200 yards out, a small dark shape briefly broke the surface of the water. Amanda immediately gasped, pointed a manicured finger at the horizon, and yelled the word dolphin. Exactly half a second later, Paul pointed his massive camera lens at the exact same patch of water and shouted that he had a dolphin on the port bow. Under normal circumstances, two human beings on a boat would simply share the joy of seeing an aquatic mammal. Instead, Amanda turned to Paul, narrowed her eyes, and stated that she had clearly claimed the sighting first. Paul lowered his camera, his face turning an angry shade of magenta, and argued that pointing a finger was a completely unofficial action, whereas pointing a telescopic lens constituted a verified professional discovery. He explicitly compared himself to a maritime explorer planting a flag. Amanda countered by loudly announcing to the surrounding passengers that Paul was trying to steal her vacation narrative, explaining that she had already drafted a caption in her head for social media, and his attempt to co-opt the dolphin was a violation of her experience. It is a strange phenomenon of group travel that people feel an overwhelming need to be the protagonist of the excursion. When everyone has paid the same exorbitant fee for the same tour, passengers will fiercely compete for the tiny, unscripted moments that make them feel unique, turning a shared natural event into a zero-sum game. The argument raged on for 20 minutes as the catamaran circled the area. Paul went so far as to pull up the digital timestamp on his camera monitor, shoving the glowing LCD screen toward Amanda to prove he had registered the water displacement at exactly 11:14 in the morning. Amanda dismissed the timestamp, claiming her vocal cords had broken the sound barrier at 11:13. They physically cornered a young, incredibly sunburned local tour guide named Hector, demanding he act as an official maritime judge and declare who the true discoverer was. Hector stared blankly at the two furious tourists and said he just handed out the towels. The tension on the left side of the catamaran became so thick that other passengers began slowly migrating to the starboard railing just to escape the hostile energy, leaving Paul and Amanda standing alone in their bitter standoff. Then came the twist. As the captain finally steered the boat closer to the coordinates of the alleged wildlife, the shape bobbed to the surface again. It was not a dolphin. It was not a seal. It was a partially submerged black plastic industrial trash bag that had filled with exactly enough air to mimic the dorsal curve of a sea creature. The captain announced this unfortunate fact over the boat's loudspeaker, apologizing for the false alarm and turning the catamaran back toward the marina. A normal person would have felt a brief wave of embarrassment, laughed off the absurdity of the argument, and returned to their seat. Paul and Amanda did not. Without missing a beat, Paul immediately turned to Amanda, tapped the side of his camera, and smugly declared that his high-resolution lens had actually identified it as a garbage bag the entire time, meaning he was the first person to officially spot maritime pollution. Amanda was visibly outraged by this pivot. She instantly claimed that since she was the one who initially pointed at the object, she was technically the discoverer of the refuse, and Paul was simply riding her coattails. The two grown adults spent the entire 45-minute ride back to the pier passionately arguing over who deserved the credit for finding a floating piece of garbage. 8. Up on the top deck of a brand new luxury vessel, a ridiculous argument unfolded on the outdoor jogging track that perfectly illustrates how minor inconveniences can completely break a person's grasp on reality. The track was clearly marked with 2 lanes, a wide outer lane for walking and a narrow inner lane painted blue, specifically designated for runners. A fit, 30-something guy named Derek was 3 miles into a run, maintaining a steady, aggressive pace in the blue lane. Ahead of him, a couple in their 60s, George and Susan, were strolling shoulder to shoulder, completely blocking both the walking lane and the running lane. As Derek approached, he called out a polite, "On your left," and squeezed past them, briefly stepping over the painted boundary to avoid a collision. George instantly stopped walking, spun around, and yelled at Derek for violating the pedestrian airspace. Derek jogged in place, pointing to the giant painted running shoe on the blue deck beneath his feet, and explained that it was a designated running lane. George entirely rejected this premise. He argued that because he and his wife were holding hands, they legally constituted a single unified pedestrian entity and therefore required both lanes to maintain their structural integrity. He actually demanded that Derek stop running entirely, wait behind them at their exact strolling pace, and only pass them when they reached the wider section of the track near the ping-pong tables. When Derek understandably refused and continued his workout, George spent the next 20 minutes intentionally trying to anticipate Derek's lapse, stepping into the blue lane at the last possible second to physically blockade a man who was just trying to burn off a breakfast burrito. 9. On the 7th deck of a mid-sized cruise ship, there is a windowless, humid steel box known as the guest laundry room, which frequently serves as a psychological pressure cooker where all societal norms simply evaporate. At roughly 2 in the afternoon, a 60-year-old retired teacher named Barbara walked in with a basket of damp clothes, looking for an empty dryer. The room contained exactly 4 dryers for a ship of 2,000 passengers, creating a microeconomy of extreme scarcity. Dryer number 3 was completely stopped. Inside, a pile of men's khakis and polo shirts sat perfectly motionless. The digital display read exactly 0 minutes. After waiting a socially acceptable 5 minutes, Barbara opened the door, removed the dry clothes, placed them neatly on the communal folding table, and put her own wet laundry inside. She inserted her keycard, paid for a 40-minute cycle, and hit start. Do you ever wonder how quickly a perfectly normal person can abandon all logic when they feel their personal territory has been breached? Because exactly 90 seconds later, a 40-something man named Martin walked through the door. He looked at his clothes on the table, looked at Barbara's clothes tumbling in the dryer, and completely lost his mind. He did not care that his cycle was finished. He did not care that his clothes were entirely dry. He accused Barbara of stealing his machine. Barbara calmly pointed out that the dryer had stopped, rendering it legally vacant. Martin vehemently disagreed. He argued that because he had originally selected the dryer, he held an invisible right of first refusal over its future use, regardless of whether he actually needed to dry anything else. It is a fascinating reality of Q psychology that when people are forced to compete for a highly limited communal resource, they frequently invent imaginary rules to justify their outrage. Martin demanded that Barbara open the door, remove her wet clothes, put his dry clothes back inside, and pay for an entirely new drying cycle, simply so his khakis could remain in the warm metal drum until he was emotionally ready to retrieve them. Barbara laughed right in his face and walked out. Martin was so thoroughly offended by this dismissal that he pulled up a plastic chair, sat exactly 2 feet away from the humming dryer, and stared intensely at Barbara's tumbling laundry for 38 consecutive minutes, quietly muttering about the lack of respect for personal property. 10. In the quiet, wood-paneled library on Deck 4 of a trans-Pacific voyage, A bitter intellectual turf war broke out over a communal jigsaw puzzle. The cruise line had set up a 1,000-piece puzzle of a Bavarian castle on a central table, intended as a collaborative, ongoing activity for any guest who wandered by. A retired civil engineer named Leonard had spent 3 consecutive afternoons painstakingly assembling the entire border and most of the castle, viewing the puzzle not as a shared game, but as his own personal construction project. On the 4th day, he was down to the final, notoriously difficult section of pure blue sky. A 70-year-old woman named Martha walked into the library, saw the nearly finished puzzle, sat down opposite Leonard, and immediately snapped a blue piece into place. Leonard abruptly placed his forearms flat over the remaining loose pieces and informed her that this was a closed project. Martha calmly pointed out that the puzzle belonged to the ship, making it public domain. Leonard firmly disagreed, citing the concept of sweat equity. He claimed that because he had invested 14 hours of manual labor into the foundational structure, he held the exclusive intellectual rights to place the final pieces. He literally hovered over the table like a gargoyle guarding a hoard of cardboard gold, refusing to let her participate. Martha stared at him for a long moment, offered a polite smile, and reached into the pocket of her floral cardigan. She slowly pulled out exactly 3 blue sky pieces, placing them carefully on the table just out of Leonard's reach. She had secretly pocketed them on day 1, entirely unprompted, specifically to hold the puzzle hostage because she had instantly recognized Leonard's dictatorial energy from across the room. She flatly refused to hand them over until Leonard formally apologized for his greed, resulting in a 3-day standoff where the Bavarian sky remained permanently incomplete. 11. At the entrance to the main dining room on a luxury transatlantic crossing, a remarkably absurd standoff occurred over the exact definition of formal wear. The cruise line enforced a strict, elegant formal dress code for the evening. A 60-year-old retired contractor named Arthur arrived at the podium wearing black dress pants, highly polished shoes, and a brand new, extremely bulky, heavily pocketed neon orange and camouflage Gore-Tex hunting jacket. The maitre d', a perfectly postured, entirely unbothered Croatian man named Milan, stepped directly into Arthur's path and politely informed him that outdoor sporting apparel did not meet the dining room's sartorial standards. Arthur was absolutely outraged. He reached into one of his 14 zippered pockets, pulled out his phone, pulled up an electronic receipt, and shoved it toward Milan, loudly declaring that the waterproof jacket cost $850. He pointed at the queue of other passengers, noting that his specialized wilderness gear cost triple the price of the cheap polyester sport coats the other men were wearing, and therefore it mathematically qualified as luxury formal wear. This is a classic behavioral economics trap, the deeply ingrained human tendency to conflate sheer financial expenditure with social compliance, genuinely believing that spending enough money allows you to simply purchase an exemption from the rules. Milan, whose face remained a mask of polite marble, gently explained that while the jacket was undoubtedly an exceptional piece of engineering for surviving a blizzard in a forest, it was not a tuxedo. Arthur passionately argued that the jacket featured taped waterproof seams and breathable micromesh, rendering it completely appropriate for eating lobster thermidor safely. Recognizing that logic was useless, Milan deployed the ultimate cruise ship compromise. He offered Arthur a classic black loaner jacket from the emergency closet. However, Arthur stubbornly refused to take off his hunting jacket, claiming the dining room was heavily air-conditioned and he needed the extreme thermal insulation. Instead, he took the oversized black tuxedo jacket and simply stretched it directly over his massive neon orange camouflage coat. Milan stared at the resulting visual, a man looking like a deeply confused, highly tactical formal marshmallow, decided it technically fulfilled the requirement of a collar and lapels, and seated him at a table in the center of the room. 12. On the aft deck of a sun-drenched Caribbean cruise, a bizarre standoff occurred inside a communal hot tub over the fundamental laws of fluid dynamics. A 60-year-old retired florist named Elaine had been soaking in the bubbling water for 20 minutes, enjoying what she considered to be her personal thermal sanctuary. The tub was entirely full, right up to the internal overflow grate. At exactly noon, a 6'2", 240-pound construction manager named Dennis stepped down into the hot tub. Naturally, as Dennis submerged himself, Archimedes' principle took immediate effect. His physical mass displaced roughly 15 gallons of hot water, which spilled over the edge and drained safely through the grating. Elaine was absolutely appalled. She wiped a stray drop of water from her shoulder, glared at Dennis, and loudly accused him of illegally draining her bath. Dennis, squinting in the bright sun, pointed out that he hadn't pulled a plug. He had simply entered a shared body of water. Elaine completely rejected this physical reality. She argued that because she had arrived first, she was entitled to the exact volume of water that was present when she sat down, and by taking up space, Dennis was actively stealing her aquatic real estate. She actually demanded that he get out of the tub, find a deck attendant with a bucket, and manually replace the 15 gallons of heated water he had displaced before he was allowed to sit back down. Dennis stared at her, completely bewildered by this sudden introduction of hot tub taxation. Rather than argue with a woman who wanted to defy the basic properties of mass and volume, Dennis simply took a deep breath, slid lower into the water until the bubbles reached his chin, and let out a long, satisfied sigh, causing another half-gallon of water to spill over the edge, while Elaine watched in absolute simmering horror. 13. In the quiet, dimly lit corner of the schooner bar on the final sea day, the ship's progressive trivia tournament concluded with an intellectual dispute so fierce it essentially turned into a legal deposition. The host was a 22-year-old entertainment staffer from Australia named Chloe, who was operating on 4 hours of sleep and just wanted to finish her shift. The grand prize for winning the week-long trivia contest was a cheap nylon cruise line lanyard and a yellow plastic highlighter. The final score was tied between two highly competitive tables, one led by a 62-year-old corporate litigator named Thomas, and the other by a 70-year-old retired geologist named William. Chloe read the final tie-breaking question from her corporate-issued trivia card. What is the tallest mountain on Earth? William immediately wrote down Mount Everest. Thomas smirked, clicked his pen, and confidently wrote down Mauna Kea. Chloe collected the slips and announced that the correct answer was Everest, making William the grand champion. Thomas stood up so fast his chair scraped loudly across the teak floor. He adjusted his glasses, raised his hand, and formally objected to the ruling. He launched into a highly technical, aggressively pedantic lecture on oceanic base measurements, explaining that because Mauna Kea originates at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, its total structural height far exceeds that of Everest, which only measures altitude above sea level. He demanded Chloe cross out William's score and crown him the winner. Ask yourself, how many hours of your finite, expensive vacation would you willingly incinerate to argue about dirt measurements simply to win a $2 office supply? For a highly successful professional like Thomas, the answer was limitless. It is a strange irony of human psychology that the environment of a luxury cruise strips away the massive, high-stakes problems of daily life, leaving highly driven brains with nothing to solve. Consequently, they simply project all of their intense combative energy onto the smallest, most meaningless conflicts available. William, offended by the challenge to his victory, stood up and argued that the international scientific standard for terrestrial topography dictates measuring from sea level, making Everest the only correct answer. The two men engaged in a massive 35-minute geographical debate. They were literally drawing cross-sections of tectonic plates on damp cocktail napkins and shoving them across the table at each other. Chloe, watching two wealthy retirees nearly come to blows over a plastic marker, decided to end the madness. She reached into her plastic supply bin, pulled out a second yellow highlighter, handed one to William, and offered the other to Thomas, declaring them co-champions. A normal person would take the free pen and leave. Thomas looked at the highlighter as if it were highly toxic. He pushed it back across the table, stating he absolutely refused to accept a pity prize based on a flawed scientific metric. He demanded a definitive, singular victory. When Chloe flatly refused to revoke William's prize, Thomas stormed out of the bar empty-handed. Most people would assume the conflict ended there, but the twist occurred 3 hours later at the captain's farewell cocktail party. As the ship's captain, an impeccably dressed Swedish man, stood in the atrium shaking hands with guests, Thomas confidently bypassed the entire line. He walked straight up to the commander of the massive vessel, pulled the damp cocktail napkin out of his pocket, and demanded the captain issue a formal maritime ruling on whether the bottom of the ocean counted as the base of a mountain. The captain, whose actual job involved navigating 100,000 tons of steel through unpredictable weather systems, stared at the ink-stained napkin, looked at Thomas, and calmly replied that as far as the ship was concerned, the only thing at the bottom of the ocean was the anchor. Thomas was so outraged by this entirely practical maritime logic that he spent the rest of the evening sitting alone in the library, drafting a 3-page formal complaint to the corporate entertainment division about the entire crew's negligent lack of geological rigor. It's amazing how far people will go to avoid admitting they were wrong. Honestly, if you passionately claimed you spotted a dolphin and it turned out to be a trash bag, are you doubling down to claim the garbage or just walking away in shame? Tell me below. If you want more dry, psychological breakdowns of people losing their minds in luxury settings, hit subscribe.